A listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, the new Australian research that shows that antidepressants don't work for some people living with depression. The breakthrough discovery is being hailed as a game changer in the way we diagnose depression and could also lead to far more effective targeted treatments. Those details in just a moment. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Friday, the 16th of January. Another setback for the Prime Minister's hate speech reforms, with some of Australia's most prominent religious leaders urging the government to halt their hate speech reforms, fearing the new legislation may limit religious freedoms. The open letter has been signed by leaders from almost all denominations, including Christian, Catholic, Muslim and Protestant faiths. However, no Jewish groups signed the letter. The proposed legislation is set to be debated in Parliament next week, with both the Greens and Coalition not supporting the proposed changes in their current form. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says the opposition had been calling for an overhaul of hate speech laws, but now won't support the legislation or put forward changes.
The Coalition are yet to put forward a single proposed change. They haven't bothered to have a shadow cabinet meeting as of yesterday at the time that Susan Ley had her press conference. They hadn't even had an internal process.
Venezuela's opposition leader, Maria Machado, has presented her Nobel Peace Prize to US President Donald Trump during a meeting in Washington. Ms. Machado says the gesture recognised what she called Mr. Trump's commitment to Venezuela's freedom, comparing it to an historic symbol of solidarity between the US and Bolivia.
200 years in history, the people of Bolivar are giving back to the heir of Washington a medal, in this case a medal of the Nobel Peace Prize, as a recognition for his unique commitment with our freedom.
President Trump thanked Machado on social media, calling it, quote, a wonderful gesture. However, Nobel officials say the prize cannot be transferred. Machado, who won the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize for her pro-democracy advocacy, is lobbying Washington to help push for political change in Venezuela. And the mother of one of Elon Musk's 14 children is suing X, formerly known as Twitter, alleging the company's AI tool Grok generated sexualised images of her, including one of her as a child. Ashley St. Clair, who is a right-wing Jewish influencer, also alleges Grok generated images of her wearing a swastika bikini. The 27-year-old filed the lawsuit in New York, seeking punitive damages and also compensation. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the new research from the University of Sydney's Brain and Mind Centre that shows antidepressants don't work for some people living with depression, with also high risks of side effects. The report's senior clinical lead, Professor Ian Hickie, joins us to explain why this breakthrough discovery is a really important step forward in understanding how depression affects everyone differently and also why targeted treatments are needed. Ian, thanks so much for joining us. Tell us about this research. This is fascinating.
So this research is a large collaboration between ourselves at the Brain and Mind Centre and the clinicians involved in treating depression and the Queensland Institute of Medical Research and their strong genetic capability. Over 20,000 Australians have joined something called the Australian Genetics of Depression Study because they really want to understand what causes depression, how many different sorts of depression there are, and most importantly, could we do a better job at selecting the best treatment for people first up, right up, rather than what we rely on at the moment, which is rather hit and miss, which is rather trial and error. So this research looks at about 15,000 of those people who've provided genetic data from a saliva sample and their experience of taking antidepressant medicines. Now, the good news in the depression area is about 2/3 of people respond well to the currently available antidepressant medicines, the so-called SSRIs or Prozac-like drugs that largely act on serotonin, noradrenaline and monoamine. So that's the good news, 2/3 do well. The bad news is about 1/3 do not do well. And the big question is, why not? What is it about that and could we identify those people? So one of the long-standing issues in depression, if you go back 50 or 60 years to the old medicines we had, is there seem to be two different groups, so-called typical depression, where people had sleep disturbance, weight loss, severe depression, motor changes, and they responded well to the old tricyclic drugs, which again focused on serotonin and noradrenaline, but had lots of side effects. The second group, which were then called atypical, because they were the minority, had oversleeping, weight gain, severe fatigue, and other episodic changes. Their depression came and went in waves. As a consequence of that, they're called atypical, but they responded to something called monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Largely, that group of drugs hasn't been well developed since. So it's about a 50-year history, and then in the 30 years since, much more emphasis has simply fallen on the serotonin-like drugs and that simple explanation of depression. And in one sense, that's been very good for those people who have that anxiety-driven type, but not so good for those who are called atypical, where it looks like something different is happening. Now, in the modern genetic age, we can start to look at the genetics of these different types of depressive disorders and look at what is going on. And in this particular study, with 15,000 people contributing, we can look at the genetic signature of the people who are not responding. In fact, they're doing very badly. They're not only not responding to the serotonin drugs, they're developing many more side effects, and particularly those related to weight gain and metabolic disturbance over time. So now we've got new tools to try and solve an old problem, and we're rapidly, with the help of many Australians, making progress with that.
So Ian, in regards to breaking down that for people, we know that antidepressants work incredibly well and can be life-saving for so many people. But for the other 20%, your research is showing that they actually don't work very well. So does that mean there's any way we can work out exactly which category someone may fall into that's living with depression? How easy or hard is that to do?
So the first thing we say is we have to say there are different types of depression. Just saying all depression is the same and it's mild, moderate or severe doesn't help. Also, it doesn't help to simply say one kind of depression is biological and another's just circumstantial. That doesn't help either. The truth is there are different kinds of depression biologically, and the environmental circumstances in which they become severe or recurrent are also different. So what we've really concentrated on here, the so-called atypical group, what we find is strong associations with disturbances of the body clock, of your 24-hour circadian rhythm. And you can tell that by if you're an evening person. I personally really like evening people. They stay up late, they do interesting things, they go out a lot. They're not the sort of people who go to bed at 9 o'clock every morning, at 9 o'clock every night and get up at 6 a.m. every morning. Those boring, predictable people. Those boring, predictable people sadly get less depression. Those really interesting evening people who stay up with irregular cycles, unfortunately, are more prone to these types of atypical depressive illnesses. They're more likely to oversleep, they have fatigue, they're more likely to develop hibernation-like syndromes, to get depressed in winter, to gain weight, and to have metabolic disturbance. So we know there are some observed changes, but they're not very precise. Where a lot of this work is going is exactly what you alluded to, is developing tests, two sorts, combination of genetic tests. And this study for the first time shows really strong associations between this kind of depression and, interestingly, ADHD, disturbed rhythms in kids, the kind of ADHD kids who don't sleep very well either, and also strong associations with bipolar disorder, those people who have a kind of on-off periods of low depression and low activity followed by high activity. So there's a cluster of regulatory problems they share in common, and we're trying to work out what combination of those might tell us genetically that they've got this sort of problem, in addition to what you can now record with your own wearable devices, with your own watches, etc. You can track your own sleep-wake cycle. You can work out how regular or irregular it is, how much it's affected by seasons. So our goal at the moment is to try to combine genetic information we can record from you during an episode or between episodes, and the sort of symptoms you have. Because what we'd really like to do, Natarsha, is get it right the first time, is not simply say your depression is mild, moderate, severe, or your depression is simply due to circumstances or not. But really, what are the things behaviourally, environmentally that you need to do if you've got this kind of depression? And then from a medicine's point of view, not put you down the simple SSRI path as if it's all the same. There's no simple aspirin here. There's no simple ibuprofen. There's no simple anti-inflammatory for depression. You need to work out which medicine, which psychological approach, which environmental factors actually work for you in a much more personalised way.
Ian, it would be extraordinary if we were able to, moving forward, as you've just alluded to, the fact that depression affects everyone differently. We can't treat everyone exactly the same. To what degree do you think with this research is disturbed sleep and genetic or biological factors a key contributor or indicator of which type of depression you will get?
So we'd like to replace the term atypical depression with something else like circadian depression or body clock depression, to not say what it's not, but to say what it is. So most of our research is focused on that. And the targets for treatment then would be stabilisation of that body clock, that thing we all rely on every 24 hours to keep us healthy and well. In fact, we often say this kind of depression is much more like being jet lagged all the time. It's like knowing you're in one place, but your body and your body clock is really somewhere else. And you feel tired and your gut is out and your metabolism is out and your concentration's no good and you're asleep at the wrong time. It's much more like that than low mood or hopelessness or helplessness, which you see in more typical depression. And therefore the treatments, behaviourally, psychologically, and also medically, would be much more focused on that. Now, we're lucky these days, we do have different antidepressant treatments, behaviourally, psychologically, but also medically. There are melatonin-focused antidepressants, and melatonin is the principal hormone that drives the onset of sleep and helps to regulate our 24-hour cycle. And there are other new antidepressant treatments that similarly affect the body clock or affect other neurochemical systems and not simply the same old serotonin system.
So, Ian, if someone is listening to this and thinks, okay, I want to work out exactly which depression I may have, how do I get the right treatment and the right diagnosis? What advice would you give them? Because as we know, there are so many hardworking people in the mental health space, the many incredible frontline workers, the GPs, also the psychologists, but we know it's incredibly difficult to see the right professional and also really expensive. So what advice would you give to people who are living with depression, how they get the right diagnosis and also the right treatment?
And that's actually the nub of the whole problem, Natasha, is good assessment. And we do have a huge problem at the moment with personalised assessment and more specialised assessment. It's really expensive. It's hard to get outside of a crisis. It's really difficult to access in our public health system. So that's right. So in any of these interactions, you've got to have good information. If you think this sounds like you and you've had bad experiences with current treatments, get one of those wearable devices, record your sleep-wake cycle. Ask your GP to do blood tests about your metabolism, not your blood glucose, but your fasting insulin, which is often disturbed in this area in people who are quite young. Find out what runs in your families. Record whether your mood and your weight does change with the seasons. Start to actually provide that information, then turn up. Now, I'm afraid to say, doctors say they hate this, but it's not true. Turn up to the doctor with good information. Here's me. Not anybody in general. Here's me. Here's what I know. I think maybe it's my body clock. Now, what do you think? And simply before you prescribe one of those common drugs, which works really well if I was an anxious depressive, it may not be for me. What else you got? And so actually, empowered consumers in this area, empowered clients get better care. Now, most doctors, GPs, psychologists, psychiatrists, if you turn up with good information, they'll go, it's great. I love it when patients I see turn up with information. They go, look, Ian, what you prescribed didn't work. I did all those things, it didn't happen. Don't do the same thing over again. What else is there available? So knowledge and personalised information really helps. And now we have the technology, and feel free to talk about this kind of thing. Feel free to say, look, I've heard that these kind of things is different. And there are, in fact, different treatments. Now, I think the issue is then being able to push the health system to respond. Now, I'm afraid to say, if you have any chronic health problem, the more information you've got, the better the care you'll get. So being informed about yourself, because the real task here is that mental health is highly personalised. We, with you, need to work out what works for you, not for your brother, not for your sister, not for your mother, not for the person down the road, not for the person in the book club. What works for you? And that's something we can increasingly do by tracking it and trying to match the type with the available treatment options.
It's such an important conversation, and thank you very much for working out another piece of this very difficult puzzle that affects so many Australians and so many families. We really appreciate your time as always. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you so much for your interest.
That was Professor Ian Hickie from the University of Sydney's Brain and Mind Centre. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow with the weekend briefing. And on tomorrow's episode, Sacha Barbagat is joined by co-host of Big Small Talk, Hannah Ferguson.
Do you think it's helpful having the distinction of right, centrist, left?
No, absolutely not. And I think that there are certain political issues which actually are best debated because they don't fall into categories of whether you're kind of aligned with your group, your tribe or not. The tribalism of our consumption of media and of our siding on different issues is a huge problem because people often will choose a certain angle or viewpoint because it's what their community believes, not necessarily what they've actually come to of their own volition.
And we'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. See you next time.